SoftPOS is not especially new. This ability to accept payments on a standard device like a mobile phone has been around for a few years. Because the merchant doesn't have to pay for an additional device, it's been a great solution for micro merchants who want to accept card payments. But now we're starting to see larger merchants getting more interested in it. Why is that? What are they doing with it? What benefits does it bring for them? And are consumers happy to pay in this way? Let's find out in this episode of Navigating Digital Payments.
Welcome to the Navigating Digital Payments podcast, brought to you by Worldline, bringing you the latest innovations, trends, and predictions about the future of payments.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Navigating Digital Payments podcast. I am David Daly. I look after the Discovery Hub here at Worldline, and I'm really thrilled to have three people joining me on this episode who bring a wealth of experience on this topic of SoftPOS and how the use of SoftPOS is changing. So we have with us David Poole. He is a SoftPOS expert with over 20 years of experience in payments, including several senior positions in leading payments companies. David, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, David. Great to be here.
Really great to have you on board. We're also joined by two guests who are returning to the podcast for a second time. We have with us Mark McMurtry, an award-winning independent consultant focused on payments and fintech. Mark, great to have you back.
It's great to be with you again today and to explore this topic, which has progressed since we initially discussed it.
Absolutely. So yeah, brilliant to have you on board again for a second time. And also rejoining the podcast, Fred Frizaran, the head of pre-sales for the retail segment at Worldline. Fred, welcome back.
Thank you, David, and great to be with you all today.
Fantastic to have you guys here. Later, I think I really want to hear from you about some of the more interesting, novel, new use cases that SoftPOS is being used for, as well as perhaps how consumers are responding to this. But before we come on to that, David, maybe I can start with you, because what I mentioned in the introduction is that SoftPOS has traditionally probably been seen as a low-cost solution that's good for very small merchants, micro merchants. But how have you seen that changing?
Yeah, it's a great place to start because really SoftPOS, it's hard to think now, actually. It's been over a decade since SoftPOS started, I think 12, 13 years ago. And initially, the schemes were interested in capturing those transactions which hitherto had always been in cash, estimated at some 4.5 billion transactions a day, I think, in terms of cash transactions, low value transactions, often carried out by tradesmen in the home or in pop-up shops. And it was felt that buying a terminal was a huge barrier to those folks. So the schemes were interested to compete with cash in that marketplace. But it wasn't straightforward. That there was also a lot of hesitancy around security. I remember famously meeting with a guy in Visa Europe who told us, "Over my dead body, would you ever take a payment on a mobile phone?" But a decade later, 3 PCI standards later, we started with SPOC and then CPOC and now NPOC. The marketplace has been evolving and has been growing all the time. So the technology can successfully now allow a payment on a smartphone, and it's doing that. But larger enterprise clients are starting to think, well, what does it mean for them? And you can't limit the technology to the micro merchant. So large enterprise are viewing technology and saying, how can we use this in store? How can we now, even new use cases are exploring how you can use it online with the tap on own phenomenon, where you'd validate a transaction on your own device. So where we started off with all sorts of constraints around it, the growth of contactless, the use of contactless is now over 95% across all card present transactions on the schemes. Of course, you've also got the phenomenon of smartphone use. So we're using our cards less and less. We're using the phone more and more at the point of interaction. So, this convergence of contactless and then new hardware coming to the market, which integrates NFC, allows enterprise customers, or all customers, all merchants, to think about how they can use SoftPOS technology to improve that user experience, ensure that the customer is driven to the payment point in an efficient way. And then for acquirers to think about, well, SoftPOS is really going to replace traditional terminals in lots of cases. What does it mean for the acquirers? I would forecast that over time, the market size of transactions coming from SoftPOS will increase and increase to the point that it becomes the dominant supplier of transactions to acquirers.
We always like a forecast and a prediction on the podcast, David. We'll maybe come back in a year or two's time and see how it fares. I just a couple of interesting things I think in your response. Firstly, that reminder that it's in some ways quite a mature technology, and I think with most technological advancements, there's actually a surprisingly long period of time where adoption is fairly low whilst the technology matures. And then, of course, at some point, you often get a sort of inflection point where usage really, really ramps up. I also think there was an interesting point you made, which is that SoftPOS is not just about accepting payments on a mobile phone. It's really, you were saying, any device that has an NFC antenna embedded that can potentially accept a contactless payment.
Yeah, we're starting to see, particularly in enterprise, where they're using technology which can add payment to it. So there's a lot of enterprise hardware in courier delivery service. You know, they've got a device which takes a picture of the product in the doorstep. It directs the courier to the doorstep. And that device could also take payment now. So adding a new service of payment on delivery can be conceived of quite happily for a courier. In a supermarket, you know, the self-scanning devices can be added. Self-checkout, you know, why have two devices when you can have one? And the hardware that's allowing for the NFC now is coming to market. So you've got this convergence of a number of factors. Of course, contactless has already become the preeminent methodology for taking a payment or making a payment in a face-to-face environment. So it's already, I think, MasterCard reported recently, it's over 95% of all person-to-person payments are contactless already. So it's already there.
And also, I guess, thinking about it from the retailer point of view, it's potentially fewer devices to buy, fewer devices to manage and maintain, but also then from the customer perspective, it leads to a more integrated experience because they're not being diverted from one screen away to another device and then back to a main screen. So Mark, maybe coming on to you, we've talked about some of the benefits there in terms of fewer devices to purchase and manage and a better customer experience for the consumer. Are there other benefits that you see for bigger merchants, for larger merchants in using SoftPOS?
The first thing I think is around the additional terminals. Retailers, particularly at peak times, need to have extra devices to be able to perform a queue busting services. And SoftPOS is an ideal way of being able to provide queue busting at busy and peak times. We're also increasingly aware of how the consumer has more power in the payment journey. And retailers are very conscious they need to deliver a great customer experience. And SoftPOS, again, can be a way of being able to serve the customer where they are rather than force them to walk across the store to a fixed payment point. But there's another area which I think is relevant to all retailers, and particularly large retailers, is the importance of enhancing resilience, making sure payment systems are always up and available to serve customers whenever they want to make a payment. And SoftPOS has a key role to play in enhancing resilience, because if it's architected well, it can provide extra communication options, different routes, different acquirers. So there's no longer one single failure point within a store. SoftPOS can provide alternative channels, alternative communication, alternative processing options. The final one I think I'd like to stress is also to do with capital expenditure budgets. Retailers, it's a very tough business out there. CapEx budgets are very tight, and particularly in the current economic climates. And using SoftPOS, you don't need a CapEx budget. SoftPOS can be funded through an operational budgets on a transaction basis. So those are just a few of the additional benefits to larger retailers thanks to the new SoftPOS technology.
Thanks, Mark. And yes, I think you mentioned three things really. There's the reduced CapEx, there is resilience, And then there is conversions. So I was thinking that you mentioned in store, if you have someone in the shop helping someone try on clothes or giving them advice about products, and then you have to send them over to a till and they have to queue for 10 minutes before they can pay. It's a danger moment for the retailer where they might lose the sale. But also coming back, David, to what you were saying about kiosks, I saw from one kiosk manufacturer some interesting stats about how good kiosks are in terms of upsell, and we've all seen it on kiosks where it'll suggest some extra products or things you might want to add to your order. And it's really quite significant, the kind of average ticket size when you go via a kiosk versus a counter with a traditional salesperson. So it seems quite powerful in terms of conversions, resilience, and then also from the CapEx perspective.
David, a further angle on the resilience is that if the traditional payment terminal goes down, you need to wait for an engineer to swap it out. The store can just turn on a SoftPOS device to provide an acceptance device. They do not need to wait for a replacement device. So they've automatically got extra payment terminals ready to be used and turned on if and whenever needed.
And I think we've also seen in recent years how critical resilience in digital payments is, because people now really expect to be able to pay digitally. And the case that surprised me was where people were angry, really angry because they couldn't buy their sandwich at lunchtime. And you think, well, this means people are now not even carrying £5 of cash. Cash is not the backup it once was because people are not carrying large amounts of cash anymore. Also, I think, we tend to think if your payment acceptance is not working, it's lost revenue, but it's also becoming a brand problem because there's definitely a reputational issue if you can't accept payments for any period of time as a known brand retailer. Fred, I'm keen to bring you in. Obviously, you work with many of Worldline's clients. What have you seen that our customers are either doing or planning to do with SoftPOS technology?
Yeah, sure, David. So we have a number of merchants using the technology today to support multiple use cases that David and Mark have already touched on. And that's across different market segments, ranging from retail to hospitality, transport, and many more. I think the reuse of the existing hardware also and the convenience of being able to use a single device for processing payment, but also managing stock, scanning products are some of the reasons why merchants are really attracted by the technology. We have an interesting pilot running in grocery stores at the moment, where the scanning devices that you pick up as a customer at the entrance of the stores are also used to process payment. So effectively, when the customer arrives in this checkout area after having shopped in store and build up a basket on the scanning device, the customer no longer has a need to transfer the basket to a self-checkout device or use an app to process payment. Payment is effectively processed on the scanning device, which makes the journey much more seamless. So that's just one example, but we've got many, many different examples of SoftPOS. And as I said, I think the beauty is not confined to a specific market segment or just one use case. It applies to pretty much every payment environment you can think of.
So if I understand well, that it's a self-scanning scenario where someone is scanning their own products into their basket, and where previously they would have then had a slightly jarring step where they have to transfer that basket over to a different device to complete the payment. They can now, is it just they can tap their card on the device they've been scanning with?
Just tap the card on the device, yeah. So there's no longer a need to transfer that to, as I said, to the self-checkout device or launch an app on their phone to actually process payments using the app. It's a simple tap that allows the payment to be processed. And if the payment is processed or the payment goes beyond the £100 limit, the customer has the option to use PIN on glass to process the payment.
And maybe that's just something worth exploring, because we've talked about contactless, which will make people think about the contactless limit. So just Fred, talk us through PIN on glass and how that addresses the issue.
Yeah, so I guess PIN on glass it's the same principle as processing a payment through a payment terminal. So rather than actually entering your PIN on a payment terminal, the SoftPOS technology has the ability to capture PIN entry on the device itself. So rather than actually entering your PIN on a keypad, you enter your PIN on the actual device and you're presented with a digital keypad effectively. And that technology is certified with the relevant PCI bodies to make sure that it's compliant and as secure as processing your payment through a payment terminal.
I think there's an interesting point on that, David. We're seeing already in the statistics the trend towards mobile format, which of course does away with PIN. So whilst PINs are very credible, very well established, behaviorally accepted form of verification, and I'm a strong advocate for it, if I'm using my phone to pay, it's just not required. So, if you did a demographic slice, and people a lot younger than me, but even people as old as me, and that's pretty old, a lot of those, you sit in a cafe watching people pay, a lot of people have their phone already in their hand. So they tend to use their phone to pay. They do not dip into their pocket to get their card out. And in those scenarios, and I think, statistics would back this up, that although PIN is there and it's important and it's necessary as a step up, its importance is diminishing over time. There's another forecast there, I guess, that over time the use of PIN will, I'm not saying it'll disappear, but it will be used less and less, and it will be used where appropriate. But it's not going to be used with every transaction as it was with a card back in the day of contact payments.
And it's interesting, I mentioned earlier that people are not necessarily carrying so much cash anymore. They're also more and more not carrying cards. I mean, this is incredible to me, but many people are going out with just the mobile, sometimes even just their smartwatch, and assuming they can pay with that. And as you say, then PINs are not really relevant at all.
Yeah, and imagine when your driving license and passport's in your phone, that's going to be even less reason to carry a leather wallet. So I think that trend is set to continue as well.
So I guess we've discussed a little bit there what larger merchants can be doing with SoftPOS and some of the benefits it brings both for them and the consumers. But Mark, maybe I can come back to you and say, what does all of this mean in terms of what retailers, merchants should be looking for from their acquirer?
Well, the first thing I'd say, I'll take us back to the beginning of this podcast when we talked about the history of SoftPOS was for micro merchants. With larger enterprises, what they need to do is have a solution which is scalable to the volume of transactions they're processing and also the speed of processing of those transactions that they expect. And so they need to reassure themselves that the SoftPOS solution provider and the one solution working with the acquirer can meet these two needs, high scalability and high performance. And that's a critical element for the enterprise retailer to address. But other things also that will be relevant to them is, firstly, the need to be able to have consolidated transaction reporting and reconciliation. They don't want data sitting in different lakes. They want everything all unified and consolidated. And that includes, SoftPOS. It can't be a separate silo. So those are some of the areas that the large retailers should be thinking about. But there's one additional one I'd like to bring to the table. SoftPOS provides the opportunity for a large retailer to introduce a new acquirer into their environment. They can have a secondary acquirer for the SoftPOS channel, and they can use that to help improve their negotiating power, but also, again, to come back to my point of improving resilience. So if something goes down, they've got extra capabilities for that. And I think this is an area I would expect large retailers to be exploiting, introducing enhanced acquirer capabilities.
It's fascinating, actually. I guess it's similar to many technologies where how they are used by a very small company or a one-person company and how they are used by a larger organization is by definition different. I mean, for a micro merchant, it's probably someone installing the software on their own phone, and that's all there is to it. They may not even care about reconciliation and reporting. Maybe or they'll have limited requirements in that. But with larger merchants, there are always things to integrate with, and there's always the management of the devices and the management of the software has to be done on a more industrial scale, doesn't it? So in a moment, also really interested to understand what consumers think about using SoftPOS, so how they feel about it, and also I think I'd be interested to hear from you what your concrete advice would be for large merchants who want to use SoftPOS. What are the steps they should be taking next? Before we come on to that, I do just want to remind people that if they want to get in touch with the podcast, let us know topics you'd like us to cover, give us any feedback, then you can reach us by emailing ndp-podcast@worldline.com. And also my usual gentle reminder to, if you haven't already, take a moment to subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating and a review. So coming now on to, firstly, this topic of consumers and how they feel about it. Fred, can you comment on that? And how do they find it to be paying on a device that doesn't look maybe like the usual traditional terminal that they're used to seeing?
Sure. What we're seeing is that once consumers understand the benefits of the technology, i.e., a faster payment, a more convenient way of processing that payment, they're actually very open to it and they want to use it again. I think the adoption depends on a few key factors. I think the solution has to be reliable, has to work, has to be intuitive. And also, we touched on this previously, but it needs to feel as secure as a traditional terminal. I think the other angle is, I think it's really important that merchants communicate and advertise the solution clearly, especially in environments where the consumer may not have someone there on hand to help them with the payment. I'm thinking of a self-checkout area, in an environment where it's semi-attended. You don't have someone there on a permanent basis, so that consumers know exactly what to do and feel confident during that payment process. I think it's no surprise. What we've seen is that younger consumers tend to adopt it more quickly because they're already comfortable with the mobile experience and also a newer payment method. But I think across all age groups, we've seen that if the service is smooth and seamless, people come back to it. And the feedback we've received from merchants tell us that the repeat usage goes up significantly once the interaction goes well.
Just wondering as well, I think may even be a point where larger retailers have a slight edge, because I was thinking about, there is this trust point, isn't there? So if I've met someone for the first time and they've, I don't know, done some work at my house, and then they whip out their mobile phone and ask me to hold my card against it, I might think, well, is this okay? But if I'm self-scanning in a major retail brand that I shop at very regularly and trust, I wonder in that situation how much people even really notice that it's a non-traditional terminal.
This is a great topic. I got personal experience of 10 years ago or more when we first started. Payments folks who live and breathe payments, 60 hours a week, and particularly people from schemes, could not believe that consumers would tap cards against, tablets and phones. But they, if you're not a payments person, and I've just come to your house and I've fixed the plumbing, or I've fixed the roof, or I've, done the gardening or whatever, I'm happy to pay you. But I do agree with your point. If I'm in a bricks and mortar store that I've trusted for years, it's absolutely not a problem at all. I've also worked for terminal manufacturers who we were always keen to point out the value of the brand on the terminal. But to the consumer who's not involved in payments, it's meaningless. Honestly, I mean, a consumer generally, if you take somebody who's not involved in payments, they've got the goods or they've had the service. The behavioral pattern is, I now tap my card on my phone against something, and it really doesn't matter what it is. And it baffles me that payments people have a battle with that. I think it goes against something that's ingrained in them. But the practice, and it's globally from Brazil to New Zealand and everywhere in between, I've seen it. People just want to pay and go on with their lives. They don't want to think about what this is or understand the security around it. It's their payment process. They know what to do. They tap their phone or their card and they're on their way.
So reinforcing David's point, the consumer wants it to happen, the payment to happen quickly. So what does that mean as far as SoftPOS for large retailers? The first thing is it needs to be very clear to the consumer where they tap. And this is about, on the front, on the back, on the end, on the side. So there needs to be clear icons and imageries, and to be able to explain first time where the consumer, because you don't want it to be a lucky dip, have I found the right spot? The second thing, which is also we found from the pilots, is that large retailers need to select the right tablets or smartphones which have strong antennas and antennas in the right position in order to be able to accept those payments. And so these are two elements that people have found through pilots of selecting the right tablets and phones for their enterprise, and also making sure the solution communicates clearly through use of icons and imagery where the tapping should take place.
That's a really good point, Mark. One of the biggest operational challenges in the micro merchant segment was the sheer variety of handsets that you're dealing with. I'm in Brazil, there are 1.5 million deployments, and there are thousands of different handsets. And then you think the handset's the same just because it's the same model. Not always the case, and certainly not globally. So you have these varieties. Now, actually, in that environment, the enterprise user has an advantage because typically they'd be using a common device throughout all of their stores. It's a single methodology, and operationally, it makes it far simpler than the micro merchant deployment.
Two interesting things I think came out there. So one is, Fred, you mentioned that once a consumer has had a positive experience, then they're very likely to be comfortable using it again. But the second thing is that positive experience, coming to your point, David, is highly unlikely to be about whether it is a traditional terminal device or a mobile device. But coming to your point, Mark, if they have to tap 5 times and they're not quite sure where to tap, that's the kind of thing that would put them off using it again, more than, as you say, understanding the exact technology behind how the payment is accepted. And then I think coming across all of that, what's interesting is there's some unique benefits, I think, for larger merchants using SoftPOS, but also they have some advantages, some aspects that are easier. They have more control, as you say, over the devices being used. They're not having to support as many different devices, and they also have their brand recognition, which adds a level of trust to it as well.
And they can embed the payment process where they want it within the workflow. And that will vary, by retailer, and that flexibility can deliver a great user experience.
And also on that point, I think, again, because we're 10 years down the road, a lot of hardware manufacturers are responding to those points Mark just made about clear identification of where the NFC read is, locating it in an optimal position. And certainly the likes of, those manufacturers who are recognizing that are responding to it. So it's getting better. And there's also EMV have announced a standard for contactless for mobile devices. So that's coming. It's going to be in place very quickly. And the manufacturers who want to win that business, they're already leveraging those points if they're ahead of the curve there.
I attended RTS recently, and there's a lot of kiosks and tablets manufacturers there who were present on the show. And it's now very rare to actually see a kiosk or a tablet or a device that's not NFC enabled. So the technology is there and it's ready to use effectively now.
And I think is also something you were sort of hinting at there, David, that perhaps 5 years ago, the emphasis for the device manufacturers was making the antenna suitable in terms of positioning for tapping to make a payment. Now they are actually considering this use case of someone tapping on the device and the device accepting a payment.
Yeah, very much so. We've also seen Apple obviously come to market as a brand, massive leverage there, and they are already rolling out tap to add. So with tap to add on your wallet, you can tap your card to enter the card into the Apple Pay wallet, rather than, in the traditional sense, keying in the PAN or indeed scanning it with the camera. So the consumer's awareness of NFC, both to transmit and receive, is going to increase over time, and those use cases will expand.
So maybe just a final thing that it would be good to finish off with is, if, let's say I'm a larger merchant, maybe I'm not using SoftPOS today, but I hear all of this potential and what I could be doing with it. What would your advice be to me in terms of what should be my next steps? What should I be considering in terms of implementing it?
I think it depends on the type of merchant you are. So, different merchants will approach it from a different cost benefit analysis. Your advantage may be in labor cost savings. Your advantage may be in customer service or in upselling. So it's very much dependent on that. So self-order in hospitality, for example, certain brands have led the way there, and others are now looking at and seeing, well, the consumers are so adept at ordering on their own phones. We order meals to be delivered. We can order it in the restaurant. So that might be a slightly different approach from a grocer who's looking at, self-checkout or enhancing the experience on the floor, as Fred's been describing. I think in each case, enterprise customers, I think Mark made the point earlier on, it's not just about taking a card payment. They've got complex solutions in place which are very rich in terms of the features they offer, and you want SoftPOS to be able to offer the same thing. So it's complex by nature. It's strategic as well. I think Mark also alluded to the business models and the commercial models. They're very different in SoftPOS than they are in a traditional terminal approach. So you've got to really talk to your existing acquirers. I think you've got to understand that it's something the acquirer's got at the core of their operations. It's not an overhead. It's got to be efficient. It's got to be rich in terms of the features it offers. And it's really about finding a long-term strategic partnership. It's not like buying a terminal. It's just different in so much that you're both going to co-reside. The SoftPOS partners, be that a SoftPOS vendor or be it an acquirer, you're going to live together and you're going to be successful together, or you're not going to be successful. You're both going to be unsuccessful, or you're both going to be successful. So having that confidence in the acquirer, understanding that you're both aiming and looking to achieve the same things, is a very important factor. So engage with your partners, do your research, understand what your particular cost benefits are that you're looking for, and go to market. I think one other point I would make on that is, if you're in vending or unattended, which today, strictly speaking, you can't deploy SoftPOS in, you should definitely be researching SoftPOS. SoftPOS, again, and here's another forecast, I believe unattended and vending will become in scope of SoftPOS. It's only a matter of time. There's really no logical reason why it wouldn't. And so those merchants need to be actively engaging on the topic of SoftPOS as well.
David, the thing I would like to add is that retailers understand the need for omni-channel, selling today. That's key. But why does that link to SoftPOS? Because SoftPOS is a technology which can provide that transition between the digital channels and the physical channels, because you can use it in store. It's the blurring of the line. And this is a real advantage for large retailers to use SoftPOS to digitize more transactions and wherever the customer is, to provide that consistent and great service.
For me, I think it's the technology is a game changer, and I think when merchants come to review their payment strategy, I think this should really be at the forefront of their thinking. So it's a technology that's it's attracted a lot of attention. It's there, and I think it will keep growing and growing.
What's been really interesting during this whole episode in listening to you is how, firstly, SoftPOS has gone from this solution targeting very small micro merchants and is now becoming increasingly relevant for larger merchants. And then I think it's always been fascinating to hear the special benefits that this type of solution can offer for larger merchants, but also interesting to hear that whilst in some ways it's more complicated for a bigger merchant because they have to consider more factors, they have to think about integrations, etc., they also have some benefits, some advantages in terms of rolling it out successfully. And also they probably have some additional value they can bring to themselves when compared with a micro merchant. Because I think for a micro merchant, it's really just simply a way to accept card payments. Whereas for the larger merchants, this is a way to reduce their capex. It can increase the customer experience. There are more benefits, I think, potentially that a larger merchant can realize from it. And then, of course, always interesting, always fascinating, I think, to think about the consumer. And as David was doing, step outside a little bit our payments minds and think that actually what matters to a consumer is perhaps not the same as what we all think matters to consumers. So it's something to watch out for. That was interesting. So to me, really fascinating discussion on a lot of different levels. So I really want to thank you all so much for joining us and for sharing these insights and these views. So David, starting with you, thank you so much for being on the podcast with us.
Thanks ever so much, David. Really enjoyed it. And I think it's a great topic, which is set to continue to expand and innovate in payments over the next decade, as it has done in the last.
Absolutely. I feel we'll probably need another episode on the topic in 12 months, because I also think lots changing and happening fast in the space. Mark, also wonderful to have you back on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a fascinating discussion. I look forward to seeing how the technology can be exploited by large retailers.
And likewise, Fred, great to have you back as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. I always enjoy listening and also contributing to your podcast, David.
Absolute pleasure to have you on board. And that, of course, leaves me, last but not least, just to thank our dear listeners for joining us once again as we navigated digital payments.
Thank you for listening to the Navigating Digital Payments podcast, brought to you by Worldline. Join us next time to learn more about the latest innovations, trends, and predictions for the future of payments.